A Zelda game without bosses is like a soda vending machine that only sells club soda, you know, that flavorless sparkling water, which is gross. I hate drinking that stuff. I'd much rather have a Fanta or a Sprite or a Diet Coke. But speaking of water, for the next game on my Lore of the Bosses list, we're going to the endless oceans of The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. And I'll be honest, on my top 10 Zelda games list, Wind Waker is tied with Twilight Princess for second place. So personally, I'm really excited to get into this one, and I hope you are too. If you're interested in the boss lore of other Zelda games, check out the playlist in the description below. But for now, prepare to get wet, and spoiler alert, obviously. The simplest way to go about explaining Wind Waker's many bosses and mini-bosses would be to just go in order of the game's dungeon, so we're gonna do just that. Starting with the very first dungeon in the game, Dragon Roost Cavern, located on Dragon Roost Isle, the very first mini-boss you face is a Moblin. And actually, technically, you face a Bokoblin as a mini-boss before the Moblin, way back in the Forsaken Fortress. Both of these enemies are just regular monsters stemming from Hyrule, which may or may not have originated entirely from Demise's demonic power many years ago, depending on what you believe. But in the Wind Waker, the only thing that really needs explaining is how they're here. And by here, I mean up here, as in on the surface of the ocean and not down in Hyrule where they came from. Fortunately for us, the answer is rather simple. Ganondorf himself brought these monsters up from deep beneath the waves when he began to execute his plan of regaining the pieces of the Triforce, having it ripped from his clutches all those years ago by the Hero of Time and Princess Zelda. But more on Ganondorf's story later in the video. The boss of Dragon Roost Cavern is a giant, totally not nightmare-inducing arachnid centipede lava monster insect thing known as Gohma. Now, according to a direct quote from the Wind Waker's Great Deku Tree, the monsters that stir in the Forbidden Woods are there because of Ganondorf's return, and the same reasoning can probably be used to blanket explain a lot of the monsters' appearances in the game, including the likes of Gohma herself. While that may seem like an adequate explanation, I wouldn't make these videos if I didn't think I could bring something else to the table, and in this case, I'd like to mention that I think what Ganondorf did specifically is he simply introduced one of the Magtail monsters into the cavern at some point, which then grew into Gohma, which then began to lay eggs and give birth to other Magtails and spread them throughout the dungeon. I mean, Gohma really does seem like a big version of the smaller Magtail monster, with being centipede-like, immune to lava, having a single eye and giant pincers and all that. Who knows, maybe there even would have been several Gohmas if Link hadn't obliterated these ones. Next up, we have the formerly mentioned Forbidden Woods, located right next to the rather friendly and not forbidden Forest Haven. Now, I'm not going to go super in-depth into explaining the dungeon itself and why it's separate from the Forest Haven proper and why I think it very closely resembles the Forest Haven, because I'm probably going to start up a series on the lore of the dungeons here pretty soon, so I'm going to skip straight to the bosses. The mini-boss of the dungeon is once again an insect monster known as Mothula, which comes in two versions, winged and non-winged, though I personally assume that the winged version is the fully mature version. Just like all the other mini-bosses in the game, Mothula itself is not very one of a kind. In fact, there are many of them in the game across various little caves and such, and they actually make appearances in other Zelda games such as A Link to the Past, where they appear in the Skull Woods, which is the Dark World variant of the Lost Woods. Coincidence? I think not. What Mothulas are is a very dangerous species of mutant moth that can spurt out little babies called morths that are little one-eyed spiky balls that love to latch onto moving organisms like Link and just kinda sit there, slowing you down. They don't want to eat you or anything, they just invade your personal space, which is rude. The morths themselves are present all over the place in the Forbidden Woods, which leads me to believe that Ganondorf did a very similar thing here like he did with the Magtails in Dragon Roost Cavern and just released an infestation of morths to take over the place. Lots of fun. The main boss of the Forbidden Woods is a bit more abstract to explain in that it's a living killer plant known as the Kalle Demos, and seeing as the theme of the entire dungeon is overgrown killer nature, it makes sense to me that the Kalle Demos would be an overgrown, more deadly version of a Bokobaba, of which there are several present here in the Forbidden Woods and even on the Forest Haven. It's so massive that it uses its roots as weapons and vines to literally detach from the ground and theoretically be able to move all around the place if it wanted to. Heck, it could probably vacation on Windfall Island. As far as what its name means, it's unsure, since the original Japanese name for the Kalle Demos is Kalle Demos, so there really aren't any hints there. But in the Spanish version of the game, its name is Vilipendulia, which if translated in Latin means to blaspheme or to revile, or if translated in Corsican means vilification, which is kind of the same thing. Following up on this name meaning, it could be interpreted that it relates to the Forbidden Woods directly, since the Forbidden Woods itself is more than likely the corrupted version of the old Lost Woods. But more on that in the probable upcoming dungeon video. The Kalle Demos can also be killed immediately with the forest water from the Deku Tree, so the corruption theory kind of makes sense. As far as what led to this monster plant becoming a monster plant, it can be assumed that it was due to the the same curse placed upon the woods by Ganondorf that led to all the overgrown vines around the place, and of course the wonderful Morths and Mothula. Moving on, next up we have the bosses from the Tower of the Gods, which alternatively actually is not an area that was corrupted or infested with evil or anything of the sort. Actually, quite the opposite. The Tower of the Gods and its enemies within were all created by certain people in the past. You know, kind of like all the Sheikah shrines in Breath of the Wild. The mini-boss of the tower is the very first Dark Nut you face in the game, and the reason why I say the first Dark Nut is because there are many Dark Nuts in other locations throughout this game. This one specifically, however, is a bit special because it's located within the mostly untouched Tower of the Gods, thus giving even more credence to an older theory of mine about the Dark Nuts and their literal possible blood relations to Link, which I will link in the description below if you're interested in a much deeper dive. For the time being, however, it's my interpretation that the Dark Nuts are actually corrupted old knights of Hyrule. After all, every single one of them in the Wind Waker wears a knight's crest, which has pretty obvious Loftwing symbolism on it, and as a reminder, Loftwings are the symbol of the Hylian royal family, and I highly doubt that every single one of the Dark Nuts would be able to steal a knight's crest. I believe this particular Dark Nut was placed here to test the hero, like all the other various enemies and mechanisms in the Tower of the Gods, but that it was tainted by Ganondorf's magic due to other reasons that I go into in the aforementioned video. The boss of the dungeon is a grand combat construct that snorts arrows known as Godan, the Great Arbiter. Godan's figurine describes it as a construct that was placed there directly by the gods themselves in order to test the hero's combat prowess. And this is pretty much entirely accurate, actually. It is a tester, and its title, the Great Arbiter, literally means the Great Decider, as in it decides whether or not the hero is worthy. It's pretty cut and dry, and the only question remaining is whether or not the gods themselves actually literally crafted Godan with their own hands, or if they tasked certain other people to do so in their stead. Personally, my money's on the Sheikah. I mean, come on, with all the eye symbolism everywhere, the grand ancient technology, the servitude to the gods, and the neon blue energy, yeah, it all seems to fit the criteria. Moving on, the next dungeon that Link has to fight through is actually a return to the Forsaken Fortress, now that he's descended down to Old Hyrule and retrieved the Master Sword from its secret chamber of the sages. The first boss that Link faces is the mini-boss known as Phantom Ganon, and this should be a familiar enemy for many fans of the series because Phantom Ganon made his debut in the previous game in the timeline, Ocarina of Time, where in that game Phantom Ganon is heavily implied to be a separate, living, demonic being created by Ganondorf via his dark powers in order to fight Link, after which he gets banished to the, quote, gap between dimensions, which probably means nothingness in a spooky, cosmic, Lovecraftian kind of way. The Phantom Ganons in the Wind Waker are largely the same. They are phantom versions of Ganondorf himself that he sends out to try to commit murder upon Link. They even use the same Dead Man's Volley moveset to attack Link. One thing you might be wondering though is why did Ganondorf not send out a Phantom Ganon or two to protect the Forsaken Fortress the first time around? And this is actually because of Link. See, as Ganondorf himself proves to us, when Link drew the Master Sword, it actually released the seal on Ganondorf's power. Previously, I guess, he was just running on fumes. But with his true powers restored, he's able to construct an unlimited number of these phantoms to fight against Link. And by the way, if you're interested in why the Master Sword was able to seal Ganondorf's power and also all of the Kingdom of Hyrule in stasis and why it looks so different, and why it's positioned somewhere completely different to its last location in Ocarina of Time, check out this theory I did on the possibility of a second Master Sword. You're gonna love it. It's really neat, actually. And one last thing I'll mention about the Phantom Ganons in Wind Waker is that their swords actually bear an inscription on the blade. The inscription reads Zubora Gabora when read in Hylian, which are the names of the two smithies in the mountain village in Majora's Mask. Yeah, there's probably a theory or 12 there, but we don't have time for that, so anyway, the actual boss of the Forsaken Fortress this time around is that big, gnarly, nasty, giant, child-kidnapping bird known as the monstrous Helmarok King. The bird looks very similar to the Kargroks in the game. In fact, they have nearly identical feather patterns on their bodies and wings, nearly identical feet, and the Helmarok's tail looks like a more grandeur and duplicated version of the Kargroks. This pretty heavily implies that the Helmarok is an overgrown version of a Kargrok. Maybe this is what happens when you actually eat all of your veggies growing up. I guess Mom was onto something. Now, it is possible that the Helmarok is so massive due to Ganondorf's influence or power or corruption, but I personally find that a bit difficult to believe since his powers were much weaker prior to Link's removal of the Master Sword, meaning the greater chance is that the Helmarok is really just a big Kargrok. I also wanted to mention that it shares both a name and an extremely similar fight to the Helmasaur King from A Link to the Past, both of which actually share the same name in Japanese, Jikuroku. Link must use a mighty hammer to break both of their helmets before being able to unleash punishment on their faces, and the Helmasaur King is also just a big bigger version of smaller Helmosaurs, which is yet another similarity to the Helmarock King. Helmosaurs make other appearances in the Child timeline and the Fallen timeline, but never do pop up in the Adult timeline. Perhaps this means that the Wind Waker Cargarock species is the evolution of the Helmosaur species, which would fit into Wind Waker's evolved Hyrule theme with other races and monsters. And Cargarocks in Twilight Princess are very lizard-like, and since Twilight Princess takes place sooner after Ocarina of Time than Wind Waker does, that could mean that these Cargarocks are in their middle step on their way to evolving into the ones we see in the Wind Waker, but I digress. I didn't really mean to go into Cargarocks this much, but there you go, the Helmarock King explained. The next dungeon that the brave young green boy must venture through is the Earth Temple, the first boss of which is a Stalfos. Now, anyone who knows The Legend of Zelda knows about Stalfos enemies. Simply put, a Stalfos is a demonically resurrected pile of bones. Could be anyone's bones, could be a human's, or a Lizalfo's, or a Bokoblin's, or yours, or mine. That would be gross. But the Stalfoses in Wind Waker share explanations with all Stalfos enemies throughout the entire franchise, which is that they are resurrected baddies that arise via the power of evil, which stems from Ganondorf, which stems from Demise. The main boss of the Earth Temple is Jalhalla, which is a large Poe made of a conglomerate of smaller Poes. If you watched my previous boss lore video on Twilight Princess, you'll probably recall that I stated that I believed that the Death Sword from that game is also a conglomeration of dead spirits or Poes. In this case, you can literally watch as multiple Poes gather into the mask of Jalhalla to form its giant bod, which pretty much immediately explains everything. Well, almost everything. See, Jalhalla is actually very old, ancient even. It was actually the being responsible for murdering the previous Sage of Earth named Laruto, Medli's predecessor and also the only Zora you see in the game. When you combine this with the fact that it once again appears as a mini-boss alongside Gohma, the Kalle Demos, and Molgera in Ganon's castle, it can be inferred that this means that it, or more specifically the mask that forms its big bod, was created by Ganondorf. Perhaps he once again just released a bunch of Poes and the mask itself into the Earth Temple in order to corrupt it, like he's done several times before in this very video. As a reminder, Poes in this franchise are specifically ill-spirited spirits that roam the land of the living because they have unfinished business and are filled with negativity and thoughts of violence. Combine a bunch of them into a big Poe and you get Jalhalla. The second to last dungeon in the game is the Wind Temple. The mini-boss of the temple is a Wizzrobe, which again is not a unique enemy, but it kind of is because it wears red, and it's also much more powerful than the other lesser Wizzrobes, and can even summon other lesser Wizzrobes to fight for it, which is kind of meta. Now, as I explained in the Majora's Mask boss lore video, Wizzrobes are recurring enemies across the Zelda franchise stemming from the original game of a variable power level. Sometimes they're normal enemies that you can fight a bunch of at a time. Other times, like in Majora's Mask or Wind Waker, they're powerful enough to merit mini-boss battles all by themselves. Another variable about them is their appearance, which shifts from looking like a human witch to Gru from Despicable Me to an anthropomorphic toucan in this game. I personally believe that all Wizzrobes are simply members of a race of individuals located somewhere in Hyrule that masters dark magic, and either due to that mastery or due to their own personal reasons decides to serve the forces of darkness, who in this case is Ganondorf. What's most intriguing about their appearance in Wind Waker is their bird-like physical features, such as their toucan-like beaks or their sleeves that look like wings, or the fact that they can hover in the air and fly. Given that this was also the game that introduced us to the Rito, who are the race of bird people that evolved from the Zora, it's only natural for people to wonder about whether or not the Wizzrobes are members of the Rito as well, which could very well be the case. Personally though, I tend to think a bit more simplistically. To me, it just seems like the Wizzrobes might have used their magic and turned themselves into these bird-like forms in order to achieve flight, which they can do in this game as opposed to their earlier iterations which could only teleport around the place. But it's true, given their bird characteristics, which is conveniently in the same game that introduced us to the Rito, they could be Wizzrobes that stem from the Rito race. There's no evidence to prove definitively one way or the other, and the Rito also pretty much all have long sleeves that turn into wings. Also, there are lesser Wizzrobes that appear in the Tower of the Gods. As I mentioned earlier, all of the mechanisms and constructs within the Tower of the Gods were constructed by the will of the gods and for the purposes of testing Link, so how then could Wizzrobes be located inside? Well, it's evident that at least some of Ganon's power was able to enter the tower, since there are Keese and Bubbles and Choo-Choos and lesser Wizzrobes and a crazed Darknut located within. So I suppose it's possible that Ganondorf was able to sneak in a couple monsters. I'm not sure when he would have been able to do this, but that's neither here nor there. The boss of the Wind Temple is a giant flying sand monster known as Molgera, and just like Jalhalla in the Earth Temple, Molgera is assumedly responsible for the death of the Wind Sage named Fado, Makar's predecessor and the only Kokiri you see in the game. And just to follow suit with the whole big monster with small versions of big monster vibes that the entire game has been giving off this whole time, Molgera can also release its little bibbies to attack Link, affectionately referred to as Molgera larvae. In the Legend of Zelda series, it seems that that certain words or phrases of words are often used to refer to that type of enemy. For instance, a baba is always a plant, a blin is always a humanoid, usually pig-like monster, a stall is always an undead enemy, a foes is a knight-like enemy, a rock is a bird, and a mole is a sand or worm-like monster. In this manner, the Molgera shares its sand swimming capabilities with that of the Molduga of Breath of the Wild or the Moldorms from several other games. And due to its reappearance in Ganon's tower and Fado directly saying that he was attacked by Ganondorf and the encyclopedia stating that Ganon's minions attacked the temples, it can be assumed that Molgera originated from, you guessed it, Ganondorf himself. Seriously, it's like after his defeat at the end of Ocarina of Time, he just thought to himself, you know what I should do this time around in order to guarantee me a win? Insects. Giant insects. But speaking of the big man himself, it's finally his time to shine. So without further ado, let's talk about the man, the myth, the undying legend, Ganondorf Dragmire. Ganon's tower is the final dungeon in the game, and as such, Ganon himself is the final boss. Both of them, in fact. See, the first time you encounter Ganondorf, it's not actually Ganondorf, but is rather a Ganon. Now, for a much more in-depth explanation as to what I believe Ganon is as opposed to Ganondorf, and to not be too redundant in these videos, check out the Breath of the Wild boss lore video where I went into much more detail explaining it. In a nutshell though, I personally believe that Ganondorf will transform into a Ganon when Ganondorf is infused with a great power source. With the Ganon, as in the original anthropomorphic pig-like monster Ganon being Ganondorf's Triforce of Power transformation. However, if you recall, at this point in the timeline, that Ganon is dead, thanks to the Hero of Time. And this is why that Ganon does not make an appearance in Wind Waker. It's also why Ganondorf himself does not physically transform into a Ganon in this game, even though it kind of looks like he does. In reality though, that's just Puppet Ganon, who's being controlled by Ganondorf, who is awaiting Link above Puppet Ganon's chamber on top of the tower. My take on the matter, and of course you're always welcome to believe whichever take you want, is that Puppet Ganon is the big version, if you will, of the Phantom Ganons located elsewhere in the game. Just, you know, to follow suit with the aforementioned small version and big version of monsters that this game is so fond of using. I believe that the Puppet Ganon is essentially the most powerful version of Phantom Ganon that Ganondorf could create, which again also explains why Ganondorf himself does not transform into Puppet Ganon, unlike in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, when he did literally transform into the Triforce-powered Ganon and the Twilight-powered Dark Beast Ganon. Anyway, once Link kills Puppet Ganon with arrows of light, he then ascends to face Ganondorf himself, who has had his Triforce of Power this entire time because he still retained it following his sealing away at the end of Ocarina of Time. Huge props to Nintendo, by the way, for leaving us with this foreshadowing cliffhanger way back in 1998. To be honest, Wind Waker's version of Ganondorf has got to be one of my favorites, if not my favorite, because this is a Ganondorf who learned patience. He learned how to wait and bide his time to build up scraps of power at first and eventually break out of the seal that he was placed in so many years ago. He's more solemn and mature than any of his other iterations and does not necessarily wish to bring unnecessary harm to Link and Zelda. He even goes so far as to try to reassure Link by saying, "Do not fear, I will not kill you," and he says that he wishes to sever that which binds them together so that he would not have to keep fighting literal children every few centuries. He also gives more insight into the reasoning behind his usurper actions in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. The reason why he so badly craves Hyrule's throne is because he's jealous, covetous. The Gerudo Desert, his home, is a harsh environment that few species can survive. In the day it's blisteringly hot, and in the night it's bone-chillingly frigid, something that we can see firsthand in Breath of the Wild. As the king of the Gerudo women who somehow lived in the desert, he wanted better for them. He wanted the beautiful landscapes and temperate climates and bountiful fields that the winds of Hyrule brought to the people of Hyrule, and thus he decided to conquer the royal family and try to take it by force. But now that Hyrule is all but dead and his people are gone, we're left with one final question. Why? Why is Ganondorf still striving so hard to obtain the Triforce, so long after everyone has vanished and the world has moved on? Well, that's actually the entire point. Have you ever felt nostalgic? Ganondorf did. He never wanted to hurt people, at least not initially. All he ever wanted was Hyrule. He had heard the legends of an all-powerful relic that could grant the wishes of its user, and he always wanted to use that wish to obtain Hyrule for himself and his people. But as close as he came to the Triforce, he never got to make that wish. So here, after countless years have gone by and the world has moved on from the old kingdom beneath the waves, Ganondorf never forgot about that land that he loved, Hyrule. And as he finally pieced the Triforce together again, he reached his hand into the sky and cried out to the gods above to resurrect Hyrule from its watery slumber and give it to him. But just before he touches the omnipotent relic, Daphnis Nahanson Hyrule himself, the last king of Hyrule, touches it first and instead wishes for the opposite, that the world would finally forget about the sins of the kingdom, the crimes of the Gerudo, and the entire land of Hyrule itself be drowned forever, and Ganondorf along with it. And after all this time, as the ocean begins to literally crash in over their heads with a great downpour of rain, Ganondorf cannot help but laugh in his utter, bitter defeat. And it's at this point that he lets his old, angry self shine through again, and he decides to try to kill Link, Zelda, and the king, but is once again defeated for the last time by the duo of Hylia's descendant and her chosen hero. The last thing Ganondorf feels before entering the gap between dimensions himself is the blissful wind of the beautiful kingdom of Hyrule. And that is the end of the Wind Waker's bosses. Did you learn something new? Did I miss something? Which game do you want to be covered next? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you so very much for watching. Please consider leaving a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already, because seriously, we do good stuff here. Stick around, you can always leave later. Huge thanks as always to my bandit crew, who are the reason I keep going with the channel. Say hello to Link1_87_JV and John G, who both recently joined the ranks of my mighty bandits. If you're interested in helping out, please feel free to check out the many different methods in the description below. That's all I've got for this one, so be sure to follow me on my socials, and I'll see you next time. This is Bandit, signing out. Peace!